Welcome back, everybody. This is for English 247. This is for our class for Thursday, the 16th, where I wanted to put some closure on persuasion. If you remember, I had indicated that I gave you an extension on writing on persuasion. You can hand in your second journal up until today, if you're watching this on Thursday, the 16th, at 11:59 p.m. via PDF to my email, ruiz@gcc.mass.edu. And ultimately, that means that I gave an extension also on our first paper, which will be due next Thursday on the 23rd, an approximately 4 to 5 page paper where you are discussing perhaps the story of an hour, but probably Frankenstein or persuasion, though that's not to say that you can't mix both texts, but you don't want to have a thesis that's too broad. So perhaps if you wanted to compare and contrast a character in Frankenstein and persuasion, one of the things that you could do is perhaps talk about Elizabeth in Frankenstein and compare her to one of the female characters in persuasion. Now, one of the things I had talked about with persuasion is that there are a good number of characters, and I had given you an overview of the characters, and you can see that I've done so again in the notes below, divided them up by male and female since our class has been about gender, but you can also divide it up based on relationship. That Sir Walter Elliot is a widower, and that's going to be important for our plot because this means that he is a, quote, eligible bachelor, unquote. And he does have status, and at least based on appearances, he also has money, which makes him very eligible. However, we find out at the very beginning of the novel that he no longer has money, in part because his wife wasn't there to temper his spending, illustrating the importance of female in relationship and the importance of female in society, a theme that we will see evidenced throughout the other texts of this semester. And that's going to propel the major action. How can he save face and also find a way to repay his debts? We find out about Charles Musgrove, who is married to Sir Walter's youngest daughter, Mary. So the youngest is married, but the middle daughter and the older daughter are not married. This is significant in this time period, again, because of the idea that past a certain age, a female would seem to no longer have as many options. Particularly if she's, quote, lost her bloom, unquote, which is something that we continually hear with Anne, and we see the importance of appearance, especially for female in this time period, one could even say today. And to add a little bit of intrigue here, Charles had once been interested in Anne Elliot and proposed to her, but she turned him down. So you can imagine the tension between the sisters. And then we find out about Frederick Wentworth. And Frederick basically went and found his worth, hence his last name. He has established himself through his own efforts, not through his birthright. He's done so through the military, the Navy, and this novel is very much a commentary on class as well as gender. The idea of a rising middle class usurping the former system of royalty and patronage. And he was Anne's former suitor, and Anne was persuaded, hence the importance of the title, to gently influence, to not choose Frederick Wentworth because he had not yet established himself financially or professionally. She comes to deeply regret that as the novel progresses, but that's because he returns with both status, which he's been able to achieve in the Navy, and also wealth. And I suspect that wouldn't be the case if he didn't have both of those elements, which goes to show that the author, Jane Austen, is still rather conservative despite her progressive views. We also saw that with Mary Shelley, because ultimately authors are products of their time. So as much as they can question their time and push boundaries, they also are going to be a reflection of the values of their time as well. And the major question as the novel progresses is, now that Frederick Wentworth has returned and he is single, whom will he marry? Because there are a multitude of eligible females who are interested in him because, again, he has established himself. So he's a, quote, good catch, unquote. We have William Elliot Esquire, who basically is a cousin in the Elliot family, and although he has achieved some level of professional success as a lawyer, he still does not have the same status or worth as someone like Sir Elliot. It's assumed he will be the heir presumptive because there are no living male children in the Elliot family. He courts Anne in part because he's interested in getting the title of becoming an Elliot, and also because he is ultimately won over by her personality. Mr. Musgrove is Charles Musgrove's father, and he's married. Notice he has the title of Mr. rather than Sir. There is a difference in this time period. Captain Harville is one of Frederick Wentworth's friends. He's married and has a very happy relationship. So even though marriage at the time was oftentimes one that was political or social, we see some marriages that don't necessarily follow that particular criteria. Captain Benwick is Captain Harville's friend. His fiance died, so now he's single. The question is, will he court again, and what is the appropriate length of time to mourn, which was something that we might have discussed or at least considered when we were reading Chopin's The Story of an Hour. We have Charles Hayter, who's a Musgrove family cousin. He's single, courting Henrietta. Again, not unusual for cousins to marry so that they can keep wealth and rank within the families. It's something that's still done on some level within the royal family. And keep in mind that we are in England when we are reading this text. So we definitely have a very different kind of structure. Even today in England, there's still royalty, even though they're more of a figurehead than anything else. And then our major female characters, we've got Elizabeth Elliot, who is Sir Walter Elliot's daughter. She's single, but the assumption is, at least from Sir Elliot's perspective, is that she will eventually marry, and he's definitely benefiting from the idea that she has taken over her deceased mother's place in some respects because she is now the caretaker of the family. And note again how we are confronted with this idea of motherless children. It's something that we will see in Jane Eyre as well, which I hope that you've begun reading at this point. We have Anne Elliot, who serves as our kind of narrator. We see the world through her eyes, so we're able to see the facades that she's able to see, the hypocrisy that exists and the superficiality that exists. So this novel is supposed to be critical of both of those elements. So you'll remember my attendance question of would you want to live in this world of landed gentry? At least according from Anne's perspective, that would be something that would not necessarily be entirely positive. Yet note that there are many privileges, financial and social, that are accorded to an individual for living in this particular lifestyle and in this particular society. The question is, who will ever want to court Anne again? I think there's something to be said about the idea that Anne is the middle daughter, and oftentimes she's ignored and forgotten. I think that's oftentimes a complaint of middle children as well. Mary Musgrove is Sir Walter's youngest daughter. She's married. She very much fits into the stereotype of what we were discussing with the cult of true womanhood, very much concerned with appearances, very much subject to things like the vapors. Oftentimes, probably there's a little bit of acting involved in that as well, so that she could get attention. We have Mrs. Musgrove, that's Charles Musgrove's mother. She's married. Again, the title of Mrs., not Lady, the way we saw with Lady Russell, which indicates that she's of lower status. Of course, Lady Russell is going to be very important in this particular novel because she basically takes the role of mother figure for Anne, and she was the one who was responsible for persuading Anne not to marry Frederick Wentworth initially because he hadn't established himself. So we see a kind of transformation in her character where she realizes that she rushed to judgment. We know that Louisa Musgrove is the daughter of the Musgroves and the sister to Charles Musgrove. She's single and of eligible age to marry. So the question is, who will she marry, if anyone? And she's being courted by Wentworth in part because she illustrates a strong will, something that Anne didn't illustrate. But this novel is very much about balance. Note the theme of falling that we oftentimes see in this novel, that not just are people falling in love, but characters are falling, most evidenced by Louisa when she falls off of the wall. But we also see that earlier on in the text when we're presented with some of the minor characters. So this idea of balance in order to prevent falling, the loss of control. And we talked about the loss of control with Frankenstein and about passion not being able to be controlled and one being a servant to one's passion. We have a Henrietta Musgrove, who is another daughter of the Musgroves, and she's the sister, of course, to Charles Musgrove. She also is single and being courted by her cousin, Charles Hayter. Mrs. Clay is Elizabeth's friend, so she's allowed to be in these circles, but she's only a Mrs. She's not a lady, and which is a title of honor. And she's the daughter to Mr. Shepherd, who we're introduced to as the family lawyer. This is how she is connected with this story. She also is a widow, so the question is, will she remarry? Because she's not in particularly good financial straits or in social straits. The concern is that she will want to marry Sir Walter because he can offer her a position. Mrs. Smith, again a Mrs., not a lady or not a Viscountess. This is Anne's friend, who also happens to be a widow. Again, really the only way to get out of a marriage during this time period is widowhood, which is why Story of an Hour was so important for our establishing the time period. And we know that she's not courting because she's ill and also because she is penniless. So the idea is that she needs assistance. So this is the negative of being a widow if you weren't able to access money or status, or you didn't have family or friends who had access to money and status. And then we have a Mrs. Croft who's married to the Admiral Croft. This is the sister to Frederick Wentworth, and they rent out Kellynch Hall, which is, of course, how Sir Walter Elliot decides that he can save money, is that he can rent out his residence, but he needs to create a cover story. The cover story is that he's going to be vacationing. So while he's vacationing in Bath, which was a very popular vacation spot, he's allowed his place to be rented out to the Admiral, and the idea is that Admiral Croft has enough status and money so that it wouldn't be embarrassing, but doesn't have more status, or at least based on appearance, more money than Sir Walter Elliot, so he's able to retain his dignity. The fact that Sir Walter Elliot is surrounded by mirrors really illustrates his character, that he's so concerned with appearances and with superficiality. Of course, we have minor characters such as a Viscountess, and we see how Sir Walter Elliot ultimately is humbled when he's in her presence, because now we are introduced to somebody who is superior to Sir Walter in rank, so he's eager to establish a connection. And again, Mr. Shepherd is the family attorney, who's going to be important because he's going to come up or help with the scheme of how to allow Sir Walter Elliot to save money, pay off some of his debts, but also retain his appearance in society. Keep this in mind when we read something like The Awakening by Kate Chopin and the importance of maintaining appearances. And Persuasion is divided up into two volumes. The first volume, well, basically the text as a whole, is a critique and a satire on inherited wealth. But we also get a romance story. And keep this in mind when we get to Jane Eyre, because we're going to see the same thing, a romance story, but that also is a critique on inherited wealth. Decorum and appearances, as I had indicated, are all important. Sir Walter Elliot is beginning the novel by looking at the Bartontage, in other words, the listing that is so important for him to see how he is listed. I guess a modern day equivalent might be something like Who's Who in America. And basically, he's quite distraught because there is no male heir, and because Elizabeth has not married, and also Anne has not married. So this brings shame onto the family. A baron being the lowest order of British nobility, which is what Sir Walter Elliot aspires to increase his status in the noble world. And Lady Elliot, his wife, had humored, and this is a quote, had humored or often softened or concealed, unquote, Sir Walter's failings. And this is something we read about in the Cult of True Womanhood, that this was the role of wife, was basically to allow male to achieve a higher status for himself in terms of morality. And, quote, though not the very happiest being in the world herself, she found enough in her duties, her friends, and her children to attach her to life. And again, that was the idea of how a woman achieved fulfillment during this time period: duties, friends, and children. And they were married for 13 years, or it's been 13 years, I should say, since Lady Elliot's death. And 13 is a rather ominous number, so that sets the stage for some of the difficulties that Sir Walter is experiencing. His oldest daughter is 29, right on the cusp of 30. Even in today's world, the transition to 30, especially for female, is particularly significant. And keep that in mind, too, when we're reading something like Kate Chopin's The Awakening. Middle daughter Anne is 27, unmarried, but in his mind, she's lost her bloom, so she's a hopeless cause. Mary married into a respectable family with fortune, but not nobility, to the disappointment of Sir Walter Elliot. And we see the importance of both of these throughout the novel Persuasion. And Sir Walter's fear that the Navy could, quote, bring persons of obscure birth into undue distinction, unquote. In other words, the fear Sir Walter Elliot has of losing his status and his position and his privilege in society, which is exactly what's happening. The Elliot family, again, they pretend that they are going to go on vacation, that is their motivator. And they do go on vacation, but the motivator wasn't to vacation. The motivator was to save money. And Anne stays with her sister, Mary Musgrove. She stays behind because she's usually excluded from the family. This is how we're introduced to the idea that Anne can move in a different world, the Musgroves. Not necessarily her sister's world, but the Musgrove family, which means Mary's husband, and more importantly, her in-laws, which on some levels are similar to the Elliot family because they also have a certain level of position and a certain level of privilege, but also they are very different from the Elliot family because they aren't as pretentious and they aren't as concerned with superficiality. So they're much more informal and they're much more progressive. So much so that they're allowing their daughters to decide who to date and who to marry, which would be unusual at the time, a time of arranged marriages, which again were done basically for social status. The Musgrove family also has its own hobbies and interests, and that's something that we will see later on in Book 2 with the Navy families that we are introduced to. So the idea of the rich having so much leisure on their time that all they're really doing is gossiping, and they're holding dinner parties and social functions and really wasting their time. So that's a message that's embedded in the text. And we see the Musgroves increasingly rely on Anne. They value her worth. And because they value her, her physical and emotional state changes, especially the fact that she is beginning to regain her bloom, which again is going to be important for female if she's going to be able to woo someone or to be able to date someone. And the Musgroves are connected to Frederick Wentworth through their dead naval son, who's known as Richard, who is sort of a lost cause, so to speak. But Frederick Wentworth is too much of a gentleman and too honorable to say such a thing. Oftentimes we have to suspend disbelief in this novel, though we've had to do the same with Frankenstein, where the coincidences seem rather extreme on some levels. The idea that the Musgroves would be related to or connected to Wentworth, for instance. And then we find out about little Charles Musgrove, and notice how often the same names are used over and over again. Charles and William and Elizabeth. These are considered to be royal names. Um, he falls and he dislocates his collarbone. Again, the idea of the theme of falling. Neither parent wants to stay to care for him. And Mary has this long dialogue about how unfair it is that it's assumed that the mother has to be the caretaker. We could see that as somewhat progressive, but we could also see that as somewhat selfish. She and basically her husband go to visit Frederick Wentworth. This is quite exciting that Frederick Wentworth is in town. Again, think about the time period where they didn't have access to things like telephones or computers or airplanes. So someone new in town was indeed a newsworthy event. The idea that they could move out of their typical circles and meet someone new. So both the Musgroves end up going to visit Frederick Wentworth, and Anne is left behind, basically. And it's considered the idea that Anne is going to be ultimately, the caretaker, because she doesn't have anything else going on in her life. She's the responsible one. And also the fact that there isn't a lot of esteem given to Anne, and yet Mary, despite the fact not having a lot of esteem for Anne, is putting her children in Anne's care, which goes to show that there is a certain level of trust there, whether Mary admits to it or not. The idea also of being able to put Frederick Wentworth in physical proximity to Anne is something that we see as the novel progresses. So that is our very subtle sexual tension going on between these two characters. We're introduced to Admiral and Mrs. Croft, who are quite important because not only do they rent Kellynch Hall, and not only because this also is another connection to Frederick Wentworth, which is why Frederick Wentworth is in town, because he is Mrs. Croft's brother. Again, we have to suspend some disbelief. But notice that this is a couple that has no children. So in many ways, they break the expectations of the time. And while they are married, they're quite happy with their marriage. It isn't one that's of social convenience. It isn't one that's of economic convenience. They married for love, and they talk about that the worst thing in marriage is separation. Also, they aren't part of the nobility, but Admiral Croft has established himself through the Navy. Again, a major fear of Sir Walter Elliot's. The major excitement is visiting Wentworth's friends as the novel progresses, the Harvilles and Lyme. Again, the idea of being able to leave one's neighborhood, taking a walk, as you can find, is a major event. And the Harvilles are very similar to the Musgroves. They have even probably less money, but they are much more genuine. They're much more loving, and they also are continually busy. Again, a message that's embedded within the text. This is where Louisa decides to take a risk and climb a wall, even though she's told not to, and she falls off of that wall because of her impulsivity and her daring. This is going to lead to the second part of the novel, her recuperation. And at first, Frederick was quite interested in Louisa because of her strong will. But as she said, that she wouldn't let anybody tell her what to do, which is something that Anne obviously did at the beginning of the novel. But Frederick Wentworth is learning also through Louisa that there is such a thing as extremes, and that not exercising caution can lead to negative consequences. So this is one of the ways that Wentworth is going to be able to appreciate Anne's worth. And as we continue on, we're introduced to the second part of the novel, and that ultimately what we find out that Anne says that, if she was wrong in yielding to persuasion once, remember that it was to persuasion exerted on the side of safety, not of risk, and that she was right in submitting to Lady Russell, because if she had done otherwise, she would have suffered more in continuing the engagement than she did in giving it up, because I should have suffered in my conscience. Now keep that in mind as we're reading the second part of Persuasion, and the idea that despite the fact that Anne is rather progressive, she ultimately, or at least the author ultimately, is going to give us a kind of status quo. But as we begin to volume 2, this is where we return to Sir Walter's story, as we've spent so much time with the Musgroves and Anne. And this is when Mr. William Elliot returns to the Elliot family circle. Again, we're going to have to suspend some disbelief when we see how everybody's connected to one another. Anne is out and about in the world and being appreciated. So now, not only is Frederick Wentworth interested in her, but so is Captain Benwick. Remember, he's mourning the loss of his fiancée. And also Mr. Elliot. And we see how both Mr. Elliot and Sir Walter are both trying to impress as well the Viscountess, who is superior in status to Sir Walter. Anne at one point says she was, quote, ashamed, unquote, of her family because she preferred the company, this is a quote, of clever, well-informed people who had a great deal of conversation, unquote, rather than birth, education, and manners. In other words, Anne very much appreciates the Musgroves and very much appreciates the fact that not everyone is living their lives based on status and based on rank, and it's in many ways a rebirth and a renewal for Anne. It's one of the reasons why Anne is able to freely visit a former classmate who's just a Mrs. Smith, who is now a, quote, poor, infirm, helpless widow, unquote, living in Westgate Buildings. Again, a widow without any kind of social status or any kind of economic status. And of course, the Elliot family isn't going to be too pleased that Anne is spending her time with the Mrs. Smith. Of course, no one questioned the idea earlier on that Sir Walter was spending time with Elizabeth Elliot, his daughter's friend, Mrs. Clay. And think about the idea of clay, something that shifts, something that can't be molded, because Mrs. Clay will be shifting over the course of this novel. So, as we continue on, Anne is human, and she is tempted at some point to marry William Elliot, who's becoming more and more interested in her. And she can be Lady Elliot of Kellynch Hall, of the house. But that temptation is fleeting. And she's not interested in him, that even though he was rational, discreet, and polished, he was not open. And of course, as the novel progresses, we're going to get additional information about how he's not open. And this is when we learn that Captain Benwick is really no longer interested in Anne because he spent so much time with Louisa as she was recovering that he's fallen in love with her. And even though they appear to be opposites, they seem to complement one another, and perhaps the extremes of Louisa's impetuousness and Captain Benwick's studiousness and melancholy can reach some sort of a middle point, because again, part of this novel is about balance. And Wentworth talks about how, from his perspective, he can't understand how Benwick could have recovered so easily from the loss of his fiancée who died, Fanny Harville, that a man does not recover from such a devotion of the heart to such a woman. He ought not, he does not. Of course, he's referencing himself and the fact that he still has feelings for Anne, despite everything. And we find out that Mrs. Smith, Anne's friend, just happens to be friends with Mr. Elliot. It turns out that he was friends with her deceased husband, and Mr. Elliot helped bring them to the financial ruin that she's in right now, Mrs. Smith. Think about the name Smith. It's common, it's ordinary, there's nothing to distinguish it. So she's supposed to represent somebody who is of a lower class. And that ultimately Mr. Elliot refused, even though he was a family friend, to help her secure a small inheritance of property. And the evidence is in letters. We saw this with Frankenstein as well, the importance of having letters to have evidence in order to be able to prove a story. Though this piece is not told in the epistolary novel format in the way that Frankenstein was told. And notice how Mrs. Smith is in need of male help. It's not as if women during this time period had legal rights. We find out that Henrietta and Charles Hayter are indeed going to marry after there was a little bit of tension between them, and that was a good match, not a particularly wonderful match, but a suitable match. And what Mrs. Croft says as the novel progresses towards the end, that she'd rather, and keep in mind, again, she has no children, she's married for love. And even in today's world, it can raise eyebrows for individuals to marry and not have children. But can you imagine the 1800s? And we assume that that's of choice. She says, I'd rather have young people settle on a small income at once and have to struggle with a few difficulties together than be involved in a long engagement. And this is one of the things, or one of the reasons why Captain Benwick, I should say, lost his fiancée, because they were waiting for him to establish himself before they could marry. Anne says at the ending of the novel, I think this is quite an important quote, because I really think it is also Jane Austen speaking to us as reader. Quote, men have had every advantage of us, she's talking about women, in telling their story. All the privileges I claim for my own sex is that of loving the longest, where existence or when hope is gone. The idea of who is likely to remain more steadfast when it comes to love, male or female. But the claim that men have had the advantage of women in telling their own story, we've seen how that's been turned upside down in this class with pieces like The Story of an Hour, with pieces like Frankenstein, pieces like Persuasion, and with pieces that are like coming up with Jane Eyre, for instance. And then, of course, this is where Anne is going to reunite with Wentworth and afterwards still maintain, if I was wrong in yielding to persuasion once, remember that it was to persuasion exerted on the side of safety, not of risk. In other words, not like Louisa. And that I was right in submitting to Lady Russell, and that if I'd done otherwise, I would have suffered more in continuing the engagement than I did even in giving it up, because I had suffered in my conscience. So here we see how Jane Austen is willing to be progressive up until a point, with Anne basically stating that she would do it all over again if she needed to. The plot twist is that Mrs. Clay and Mr. Elliot become a couple, illustrating that perhaps Mrs. Clay is interested in a union purely for money, which is something that she had hoped that Sir Walter Elliot had, but at least he had status. And that Mr. Elliot is not too particular now that he can't have Anne. The idea that Mrs. Clay, at least the way that she's presented in the novel, she's much inferior to Anne. But that doesn't seem to matter much to him. If he can't get status in the Elliot family, he's already got money. And then we get our happy ending. This is a romance story where Anne and Frederick Wentworth, who went and got his worth, marry, and they assist Mrs. Smith, so that ultimately Frederick, as a responsible male figure, is going to help her secure her inheritance so that she's got some financial stability. And this is basically going to be Anne's lifelong friend, along with Lady Russell, who's come to her senses and realizes that Wentworth does indeed have more worth than she ever thought possible. Again, I suspect that if he hadn't have proved himself by earning money and also by achieving status, I doubt that anyone, including Anne herself, would have accepted him. But considering the very conservative viewpoints of the time period, this is a rather progressive novel. So think about this when we start with Jane Eyre. And with Jane Eyre, a little hint, pay careful attention to names because they usually have significance. And one of the things we'll see with Jane Eyre is that Jane is not part of the system of status and privilege. And she is going to be merely a governess as the novel progresses. And what does that mean, to be a governess? One of the few jobs that were available to single female, if they were of an appropriate class and they were unmarried. So that's where we're headed. Now, keep in mind that Jane Eyre is a rather long text, but it will move very quickly. I've oftentimes thought of Jane Eyre as 4 different texts, and that there are 4 major locales that the novel addresses. So if you wanted to think about it that way, then our first novel would be Gateshead, and this would be the story of Jane as a child. And then we go to Jane in her childhood, but getting her education in Lowood. And this is where we learn about boarding schools of the time period. And then we have the bulk of the novel devoted to Jane and her adulthood. And this is the major element that usually is focused on in things like Hollywood movies, because this is where we are introduced to Rochester, who will be a love interest of hers. And this is where we get to Thornfield. And then finally, the very ending, and this is Jane's story after Thornfield. And this is in Moor House. In fact, you can even say that there's a fifth element, because after Moor House, there is Ferndean. So if you wanted to think of it as 4 or 5 different novels, it might be easier for you to approach this as we get Jane's life story. Again, the bulk being in her womanhood, as she's a governess in Thornfield, but we find out about her childhood and eventually what happens to her later on after her time in Thornfield. So this is where I wanted to pick up next class, and also to remind you that if you've got any kinds of questions or concerns about the paper, certainly feel free to approach me, but that the paper can be rewritten for a higher grade. So I think of paper number 1 as a kind of draft, if you will, in that if you are content with your grade after I've reviewed it for both grammar and mechanics as well as content, then you're done with that exercise. But certainly you can take my comments into account and expand and develop and submit in a revision of that paper along with the original graded copy with my comments, and you get the higher of the 2 grades. You have until the ending of the semester to do that, but as you know, we are in a summer session and things go very, very quickly. The good news is that Jane Eyre is our last major text of the semester. So when we're talking about Emily Dickinson, it's going to be talking about her poetry, which is much more compact, and is going to require, certainly poetry is a different kind of exercise in reading, because you have to read very carefully, because every word can have impact. But poetry is quite short compared to what we usually find in in novels, and even sometimes in short story. And then we end with Kate Chopin's The Awakening. Before that, we will do Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, but as I indicated, that's more of a autobiographical tale rather than a literary story. So I think that you'll be able to go through it much more quickly, and much. I think you'll find it to be just an easier read all the way around. So that's where we've left off. And for today's attendance question, it's about basically the ending of Persuasion. And what did you think of the ending of the Persuasion? The fact that we've got a happy ending at the end. Do you think that that was a satisfying way to end this particular story? Would you have preferred the story to have ended differently? And if so, how would you have preferred the story to have ended? So I look forward to your responses. I hope you are doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.